Hello and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Dan Ashley, news anchor at ABC7, and a longtime member of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Board of Governors, and very proud to be your moderator today. We'd like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting this Goodlit event. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce today's very distinguished guest. Nicholas Kristof is an award-winning journalist and author of Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, which is a terrific book, I can tell you, having finished it last night. For the past 30 years, he has worked almost continuously for the New York Times as a reporter, foreign correspondent, bureau chief, and op-ed columnist. Nicholas has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one with his wife Cheryl Wudunn for their coverage in China, and another for his column on Darfur. Nicholas, welcome and congratulations on your new book. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As we said backstage, 2 journalists talking, the question never gets you in trouble, only the answer. So fortunately, I get to answer the questions today, and so do you. Nicholas, it's great to be with you today.
Great. I appreciate you doing this, Dan.
It's my pleasure. We're going to get right into the book. There's so many topics I want to get to. I'll birdwalk a little bit, but let me start with what I intended to start with when I thought about this the other day, and that is just a terrific quote at the beginning of your book. Journalism is the graduate school from which you never graduate. And that is one of the things I've always loved about being a reporter. We learn every day, don't we? What does that quote mean to you?
So, don't tell my bosses, but I really just can't believe that I get paid to talk to interesting people, to write about it, to engage with this. And, as a journalist, you never really become an expert in anything, but boy, you have a chance to build new muscles all the time and to, ideally find some moral purpose in the process of learning about the world.
It's so true. We get to learn a little bit about a lot of things. And you mentioned that you can't believe they pay you to do it. I remember telling my father, who has just turned 90, by the way.
Let's just hope that our bosses are not listening.
Yeah, exactly. In my case, they're probably not. No, I told my father years ago when I first started as a reporter, I had done radio news and was working in television, and I was making no money, and I was on the air anchoring the news, and my first salary was $17,500 a year, which was more money than I'd ever seen. But I told my dad at the time, we're working 50, 60 hours a week. I said, I can't believe they pay me to do this. It was so much fun. A journalist's life is so much fun. Now my joke with my dad is they don't pay me enough to do this. But that lifelong learning and that curiosity that you have innately as a reporter has held you in good stead. What is it that you enjoy the most about being a journalist? What thrills you still?
Well, periodically, I kind of feel like Don Quixote. I, tilted windmills for my life. But occasionally, if you do that enough, you actually hit a windmill. And it's kind of exciting. And you feel like you do have some impact and some contribution. And that we certainly don't control the agenda, but we do have some ability to project issues onto the agenda. And often that is the first step toward getting them addressed. And it is just wonderful when we see real progress on issues that we care about.
It's so true. Are there certain issues that you care about more today than you did maybe when you were a young reporter?
There's been a huge evolution in the kind of things that I care about, and often they're kind of at the edge of what traditionally was covered. Women's rights, women's, girls' education, these kind of issues. I would never have imagined that if I ever became a columnist, I'd be writing about those issues. They felt so secondary. We felt like columnists should be writing about China-U.S. relations and missile throw weights and arms control and this kind of thing, and politics, of course. And those are incredibly important. But I think that we've seen a real shift in what is history. History used to be about what kings did or presidents. Mm-hmm. And then increasingly it became about social history, about what was actually happening in societies. And I've tried to, in my little sandbox, kind of take that and write about not just what presidents do or prime ministers, but also what is happening more broadly in society. And to take one example, I I began writing more than 20 years ago about a maternal complication called fistula, obstetric fistula, and it involves a hole between the vagina and the rectum or the bladder, and you can't think of anything that traditionally would belong less on an op-ed page. But it turns out that once you actually break the ice and write about it, then people think, why should millions of girls and young women suffer this condition, and when it's quite easily addressed. And so people do respond. And there's
And it's very real, isn't it? I mean, it's not what kings and queens and presidents are doing. This is ordinary Americans dealing with an ordinary issue, and that wasn't talked about.
And making a real difference. And, so that's one example internationally. And the one group that addresses it is right here, the Fistula Foundation in the Bay Area. And I mean, another, addiction has just torn apart my hometown in rural Oregon. So at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Just been devastating. And that isn't what King's did. But if you try to understand what is happening across the country, I mean, the pain, the heartbreak in so many homes, that feels like a challenge that you're getting more attention. And, I tilted my windmills.
And we certainly know about that issue very deeply
Absolutely.
here in San Francisco. And we're going to talk about a lot of issues in some specificity, but I want to just begin just a bit more broadly. I loved, and it caught my attention, which is, I'm sure, why you put it as the first line of your book. Journalism is an act of hope. What do you mean by that, Nicholas?
The book begins with me in a plane crash in Congo. And the obvious question is, why on earth any sane person would go on this, crazy plane to fly into a Congo civil war? And it's because, we journalists come across as kind of cynical, and we often have that front. But I do think that we go and take these risks because we think that if we can highlight a crisis and bring some transparency to problems around us, then that will make a difference. Mm-hmm. And so that's why journalists do run toward gunfire rather when everybody else is running away from it. It's why we talk our way through checkpoints, why we sneak into drug dens, why we do all kinds of things. And also, frankly, just why we spend weekends going through accounting sheets to try to find some irregularities. And there is some notion that we believe that coverage can make a difference. There is sort of a Heisenberg effect. You pay attention to something, and it will change.
And I know
What about you, Dan? You're a journalist. You feel that?
Yeah, I do. So that's maybe why that line resonated, because like you, I've always wanted to have adventures. I've wanted to shine light on things that needed exposure. Protect people who needed protecting, take down people who needed to be taken down for one reason or another. And we do rush in such, and I have so many great checkpoint stories where we talked our way in. But there is a certain excitement about that life as a reporter, and there's sometimes, I remember reading something Dan Rather wrote about it, that sometimes you think life is a movie, and when you're on that plane, you realize, this isn't a movie, this is real life, this plane could crash. And I think sometimes you can think that it's a little unreal, we're a little invincible in those situations, but you were reminded that day that you're not.
And I mean, I do think that journalists have often taken too many risks, and you get a couple of journalists in a bar together somewhere, and they're planning out the next day's trip, and they do something together that they would not do individually. I was lucky early in my career to get really scared out of my wits a couple of times by being held at gunpoint, particularly in one case by two drunken soldiers. And I thought they might kill me and they might not, and I had no control over the situation. And that was a useful reminder of my mortality. My wife has also reminded me of that point. And after this plane crash, I guess I'm not giving anything away by saying I survived the crash. So I pulled out my bag with my satellite phone, and my wife and I were then based in Tokyo for the New York Times. So I called up my wife and kind of shakily said that I'm fine, and asked, are you okay? And she said, surprised, yeah, I'm fine. And but I thought I shouldn't maybe tell her
Exactly.
about the plane crash right there. I should wait till I'm home, sitting up across from her, and
You're okay.
reassuringly, everything's fine. That's all behind us. And so I spoke to her, but then I had to call the New York Times foreign desk to explain about the plane crash, why I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I had no idea how I was going to get there. And then about an hour later, somebody from the foreign desk was speaking to my wife and said, "Oh, that's terrible about Nick's plane crash." I was so busted, so busted.
But you tried not to worry her.
And so that was, I learned the utter importance of complete transparency to one's spouse, even applying to plane crashes in Congo. And I've tried to adhere to that ever since.
Bob Woodruff, who's a good friend of mine, an ABC correspondent who had that terrible disaster in the Middle East when an IED blew up. And I had lunch with him, I think, a week before that happened. But he supposedly said, as he was lying there in and out of consciousness, "Don't tell my wife." Didn't want to worry her in that moment. Yeah. You write in the book that it was your dream since you were a kid to be a journalist. For me, it wasn't until probably high school. But what made you want to be a journalist? What attracted you to it?
My journalism career really began when, in the 8th grade at Yamhill Grade School in rural Oregon, the kids decided they wanted to have a student newspaper. And I wasn't really thinking of journalism, so I didn't go to this organizational meeting. But a bunch of kids wanted to write for the paper, but nobody wanted to edit it. So they chose me as editor in absentia, and my career was born. And I enjoyed the writing of it, I enjoyed the advocacy, and at that point in Yamhill Grade School, girls were not allowed to wear blue jeans, boys were. And so I took this on for my editorial campaign, and it turned out that one really good way of impressing 8th grade girls was championing their right to wear blue jeans. And so that was my my first campaign, then the school actually begrudgingly changed its policy. The idea that one could enjoy the writing process and change a school policy and, overthrow the patriarchy all at the same time was kind of amazing.
And impress the girls.
And totally impress the 8th grade girls. And, any 8th grader knows that's about the highest priority any 8th grade boy can have.
Sure. So you didn't pick up an electric guitar, you picked up a pen.
I had my limitations, so I did what I could.
This is, I want to delve into this because this was really, really compelling, I thought. And I think we're all a little conflicted by it. And I know how I've dealt with it, but I'd be interested in how you do. This is a line from the book. "Reporters said that with a touch of envy, for we dine uncomfortably on the misfortunes of humanity. Catastrophes had propelled my career forward in ways that felt unsettling. The world suffered and I thrived." Sometimes, I remember going to, that is on page 7, as a matter of fact. And I remember going to the Columbine shooting that night and some of these terrible tragedies I've gone to. And your job is to go cover the news. And when you do a good job, you're praised for that, even in terrible situations. How have you reconciled that, especially as a reporter for the New York Times, where you've covered the world?
So I think I take a couple of lessons from that. And I've seen reporters sometimes hover like vultures in ways that make it profoundly uncomfortable. But so first of all, always showing a respect and humanity to people who were caught up in that tragedy. And remember, these are human beings, and it's the worst day of their lives. And their job is not necessarily to talk to you and tell you how they're feeling. But so start off with a real respect for the people caught up in this. And secondly, to recognize that while the immediate job is to convey that to the public, there is also ideally a benefit that comes from it, that by highlighting a problem, you can take a step toward addressing it. So in the Columbine tragedy, if by covering school shootings, we can hopefully also illuminate to some degree the pathways by which we make the next school shooting somewhat less likely, that reduce other gun violence less common. And in the case of some of the horrors that I've covered, one can hold dictators and warlords more accountable, reduce the chance that that's going to happen to some other people. And this is a difficult balance to get right. It doesn't always work. Sometimes things just simply fade away. But imperfectly, we can not only cover that moment's tragedy, but also to some degree, perhaps, prevent the next one from happening.
Yeah, well said. You know, I could tell the moment I met you, actually, not knowing you at all, but I could tell I got a sense of the kind of person you were. A decent, kind, professional and diligent, but with that sense of humanity in your reporting. And I know for me, I can honestly say I've never gone home at night wishing I hadn't treated someone a certain way, covering a story. Not once. I've always tried my best to be in touch with our humanity when you report the news, and you obviously have done the same thing.
One of the things, since I began in this town of 500 where everybody knows each other, you saw when you were tough on somebody, you saw the human cost to that person, to their family. And I think it's incredibly important as journalists that we hold officials accountable, hold their feet to the fire, and that can cause problems for their family. But I think we also can do it in a way that we don't lightly or blithely, cruelly, just jump on people. And I think that often in big city news organizations, it's very easy to feel a little bit callous and to just pounce and cause unnecessary heartache and grief. So I tried to always avoid that. A week later, I don't want to be thinking, was I unnecessarily cruel to somebody?
Right. I mean, sometimes you have to be tough. That's the way it is.
Absolutely.
But not unnecessarily is your point. Yeah. Walk me through how you ended up from your small town reporting the news and getting touched by the journalism bug to going to work for no less than the New York Times. That's a remarkable arc of a career and literally the pinnacle of print journalism in America.
I was incredibly lucky, and it has nagged at me a little bit because my community has been quite unlucky. And I see this, I've been very lucky and very successful. My luck at each stage is fed on it. So from my little school, I was accepted to Harvard, partly because there was one member of the Harvard admission committee who was from rural Oregon. And then, once I was at Harvard, it was more likely that I was going to win the Rhodes Scholarship. And then the Rhodes Scholarship made it more likely that I'd be taken for Washington Post internships. And the Washington Post internships made it more likely that the Times would hire me. And I think that when people have been successful, there's a danger that one looks in the mirror and says, boy, you're smart. You worked hard. You totally earned everything that you got. And there's no doubt that people work hard and are smart, but they typically also are incredibly lucky in the parents that they were born to, in the love that their parents showed for them, and the way their parents read to them, hugged them. And I'm always reminded that was not happening in a lot of the homes around me, and that disjunction in that childhood really played out and fed on itself in many, many ways.
So even with hard work, some luck is required in almost all of our lives, without question. But when you started to work at the New York Times, what was your ambition at that moment? Just to be a reporter for the New York Times? Did you have bigger plans to cover the world? What did you want to accomplish when you got that job? Or just sometimes when you get just hang on to that job for a while?
So I did want to be a foreign correspondent. And I had sort of vague notions that I wanted to somehow find a moral purpose in journalism. I didn't know quite what it was going to be or how, but my dad had been a World War II refugee, and so I was very aware of crises worldwide. I wanted to be able to cover those, help address them in some way, and I went into journalism in part because I'd seen Watergate, and Watergate was a case where journalists went in and provided accountability where the system had had not been able to do that. And so I didn't know if I was going to be headed to Washington or internationally or never get anywhere. But I did want to find some way to find some kind of outlet for that passion, that desire to have some impact.
What do you think the moral purpose was that you, as you look back on it now, how do you quantify what the moral purpose was that you were looking for in journalism? Just to be truthful, just to be honest, just to expose what you can?
So I think all that is important, but I think that where I've been able to have some impact, I think there's a misperception that columnists have an impact by changing people's minds on issues. And the truth is that where I write about issues that people have thought about, if I write about Trump, if I write about Gaza, if I write about gun policy, I don't really change anybody's mind, or almost nobody. It's really the capacity to shine a light on some neglected issue and project it onto the agenda and make people think about it. That's where we have power. And so that's where I think here and there and consistently I've been able to have some impact by making people think about a topic. Darfur is an example that it's just in the middle of nowhere, terrible things, terrible atrocities were happening. But once people were talking about it, then it became very difficult for the White House and others not to take steps to address it, to send peacekeepers. And it was a tragedy that hundreds of thousands of people died unnecessarily in the most brutal ways in Darfur. But because there were so many people around the country who rose up and said, this is outrageous, never again, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today
who didn't
because of that kind of collective action.
Right. So your mission as an op-ed writer is not to try to persuade necessarily, but to illuminate and to just expose an issue to people. Start the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a funny thing for a pundit to say, but I don't really believe that much in punditry. I think there are probably too many pundits, and there are a lot of people. I mean, the model, I think, for a lot of opinion journalism today, especially on cable television, but not just, is, a lot of people who, stir the pot without necessarily adding to the pot. And I think that where we, have impact, it's by the reporting part of what we do. And when I was writing about Darfur genocide, for example, my opinions, frankly, weren't very interesting. The idea that genocide is a bad thing, not a really
Most would agree.
Interesting thought. But the reporting makes a difference. Some of the work I did on human trafficking, likewise. I mean, the idea that kidnapping and raping girls is a bad idea. That's not, what's important there is not the opinion, it's the reporting about how widespread that is and the fact that we can indeed address it.
Yeah. You started obviously as a reporter for the New York Times, and you moved through the ranks to different jobs, became an editor. And I want to talk about that quickly and then get to some specific stories that you covered. What was obviously being an op-ed writer is exciting, joyful, and gives you a unique platform. How is it different than being just a shoe leather reporter? What do you like about both jobs? What do you miss about being an everyday reporter, and what do you like about being an op-ed writer? What's the big difference?
So, in many ways, as a foreign correspondent in particular, I had a tremendous amount of freedom when I was covering China or Japan or traveling around the world. I really did have a lot of freedom, and that is, I think, similar to the freedom that a columnist has. When you're in New York, rather less so. If you're in the Washington Bureau covering the White House, a little less so. And what I never wanted to get imprisoned in is the idea of stenography, to be a reporter covering officials at press availabilities and,
a scribe, really.
But there are plenty of reporters who are able to do just, extraordinarily important work, precisely adding to the pot. And I think I was able to do that as a foreign correspondent and as a columnist.
Did you have freedom, Nicholas, as a foreign correspondent to cover what you wanted to cover, or was it always just something you were assigned to do?
No, I had great freedom. I mean, and that was kind of the golden age of foreign correspondence. There were fewer editors. People often didn't have any idea, what I was working on, maybe not even where I was. And that was...
So you could just go in pursuit of a story.
Absolutely.
Without a great deal of oversight all the time.
Very little hand-holding.
Yeah.
And And, we had a lot of freedom in making judgment calls about how to write about China, for example, after Tiananmen. And it was, it was morally complicated because here's a government that had brutally repressed protesters, killed many hundreds of them, and yet it was also building one university a week, lifting more people out of poverty more quickly than any society in human history, and wrestling with that contradiction made it completely fascinating, but was really hard to try to figure out how to get right.
When you moved to be an editor, and I would presume, like most reporters, the editors used to drive you crazy when they tell you what to do and tell you how to write something, and then you became an editor. Why were you so motivated to do that? Just the next step up in a career?
So, I was, the editor at the Times was trying to lure me into editing, and I was a little resistant. So finally he offered me the job of editing the Sunday New York Times. How could you turn that down? How could you, and so, but it was kind of funny because as a reporter, essentially you learn editor management techniques.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, as an editor, I became engaged. I had to learn these reporter management techniques.
It's true. I can relate.
One editor told me that his wife had made him get the book. What is it like? How to talk so your kid will listen, and how to listen so your kid will talk, or it's something along those lines. Yeah, but it was basically to deal with his teenage kids. And he said, didn't really work for my kids at all, but was very helpful in dealing with reporters. And so, you try to figure out how to empower the reporters, get the best out of them without
breaking their spirit, really.
Without breaking their spirit, or without really offering too much guidance, because they know the story.
Right. It's a balancing act, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
But all journalism, of course, is a balancing act.
Sure. I told the boss one time, journalists are by nature a little rowdy, and we want to stir it up and ask tough questions. I told the boss one time when he was mad at me for having an opinion about something in the building, I told him, listen, I can't be a pit bull out on the street and a sheep when I walk through the door. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't. So, as you discovered as an editor, you have to manage the reporters in the way that when you were a reporter, you wanted to be managed.
That's right. And I think that, I don't know about your newsroom, but I think in a lot of newsrooms, the last few years have created real divisions, partly related to coverage of Donald Trump and how we should cover him, to what extent we use the word lie, this kind of thing. And I think there's a sense that traditional forms for news coverage haven't always worked very well. I think in 2016, we completely failed the public with our coverage of the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump race. And so we're kind of exploring and trying to feel, how we should do that.
Go for it. It's a more complicated age. I was going to ask about this, but since you brought it up, let me ask you now. How did we fail the public as journalists in 2016?
So if you looked at opinion polls in 2016, the public thought that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were similar in the degree of to which they misled people, to which they dissembled. And in fact, every reporter covering that race knew that Hillary Clinton was fairly typical in how much she dissembled. Donald Trump was off the charts. We knew that. We did not convey that. And so I think we failed the public in this very close race. And I think we also periodically leaped on things, emails maybe, that weren't as fundamental as we.
Why do you think journalists did not expose that at that time?
So
what were they protecting or ignoring?
So let me see if you agree. So I think that traditionally in journalism, we've had two lodestars. One is the idea of fairness, and we quote people on each side, give them a chance to speak. And the other is truth, that we convey that what is happening as we understand it. And normally they work together. And if you quote people on each side of some conflict, then the public ideally will kind of figure it out. But that doesn't always work. In the civil rights period, it did not work to quote Martin Luther King Jr. in one paragraph and George Wallace in another. The public didn't necessarily understand that, what was actually going on, where the truth lay. And so it took some really, really brave civil rights reporters to actually go down south and report on the realities of the Jim Crow South. And likewise, covering the Joe McCarthy hearings and him accusing people of being communists. It did not work just to quote him and then to quote the person he was accusing. It took Edward R. Murrow to point out that McCarthy was just a lying bully. And I think likewise in 2016, that fairness model just fundamentally did not work so well. And when there is a tension between the two, I think our fundamental priority, the paramount obligation, is to convey the truth as we understand it. And that is hard, and it requires a certain humility because we get things wrong. But that's also the model we take in covering the world. If I'm writing about Vladimir Putin or about Xi Jinping or other people, then I don't say that lying thug Vladimir Putin brutalized more people in Ukraine today. And I will quote him as saying, he's a special military operation, and he says he's going after Nazis in Ukraine. But I will also make clear that that is not true, and that he is not a Democrat, and that there aren't Nazis in Ukraine. And so we try, on the one hand, to quote people like Putin or Xi Jinping, but also to make sure that we convey to the readers our best understanding of the reality. And I think we need to take that toolbox and also apply that in this country, with the caveat that it's very hard to pull off.
It is hard to pull off, and I think sometimes newsrooms are, despite what the public perception might be, newsrooms are very reluctant to do something that would interfere with an election, in an unfair way.
Yep.
Right? So we can be very cautious, and I think maybe in 2016 we were too cautious.
And this year will be a great test. I mean, we'll see how we do this year. But
what does your gut tell you about how the media will do?
Well, I mean, my fear is that cable television in particular is nervous, is very competitive, is nervous about the business model, and putting a camera on Trump is actually a pretty good way to monetize him, and you get audiences. He's entertaining in the way that a car crash is, people rubberneck. And so the risk is, I fear, that this year there will be a lot of television cameras on him quoting really outrageous things that he says without the fact-checking, the context, the truth squatting, which I think is just an absolutely essential part of that reporting.
Yeah.
And if this were Putin or Xi Jinping, we would obviously, we would quote him, we would put him on TV, but we would also provide that context and make sure that the truth got through. And I think this year it's going to be really important that we do the same.
Just as an aside, I think one of the challenges for those of us in electronic media, and print, of course, has been affected by this, is people tend to lump it all together. And you see a man or a woman in a suit talking about the news on cable, and it seems the same in some respects as a man or a woman in a suit on the networks doing what we call a broadcast of record, reporting the news of the day. We don't
Right.
have opinions. We're not shouting at each other. We're just reporting the news. I think they get conflated a little bit. People get not confused, but they just think it's all the same and it's different. How do you think that has affected what you do in print journalism? That noise that's happening out there, grabbing a lot of attention with megaphones.
So I think the underlying problem is that reporting can be expensive, and putting two people in a studio together and have them yell at each other or wave their fists is actually really cheap. And that relates to American issue. I mean, I'm still really frustrated by the lack of coverage in this country of people left behind. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were important stories to cover, but every 2.5 weeks we lose more Americans to drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost in 20 years of war abroad. And I don't think that we in the media have adequately covered that. I don't think our leaders have paid enough attention to it. I think this undermines America's competitiveness. I think we've failed an awful lot of people around the country. But it's expensive to cover these issues. It can involve a certain amount of risk. And I mean, Anderson Cooper, CNN sent Anderson Cooper to cover the Congo election in 2005, and Congo is a story that is very, very near and dear to my heart, the most lethal conflict since World War II. And Anderson did some great coverage, but those days he was in Eastern Congo, his ratings fell compared to other networks. CNN hasn't let Anderson Cooper anywhere near Congo since. Right. And that's because of the tyranny of ratings and how we in the media figure out how we can both preserve our business model and also preserve our commitment to stories that really matter and not just have talking heads, stir the pot. That is our great challenge in the media. And we also need all of you to hold our feet to the fire and hold us accountable in the same way that we try to hold politicians' feet to the fire.
Well, and I think one thing that's changed I want to ask you about in the last handful of years is it used to be that you would write something, Nicholas, and people would read it, and maybe you'd get a letter or a phone call every now and then, or I would broadcast something and people would see it, and maybe I'd get a letter or a phone call. Now we're very much engaged in a constant two-way conversation because of social media with our readers, our viewers. They do hold us accountable, I think, in different ways than they used to. Would you agree that we have more of a dialogue with our readers and our viewers than we ever have?
Yeah, I think that is probably true. I think that we are less the gatekeepers than we traditionally were, that the more avenues, Black Twitter, for example, was, I think, a really useful thing because I think the mainstream media often ignored a lot of stories that were important involving African Americans, and Black Twitter helped elevate them. And so in some ways, social media have, I think, been quite helpful in keeping us on our toes and correcting us when we screw up. But boy, they have added a real level of toxicity and misinformation and disinformation to the picture as well.
It sort of poisoned everything in a lot of ways, I think. It's made us harsher, more judgmental. People have divided themselves into their own camps in a different way that I've noticed in the last 5 or 10 years.
So I think that's true, but I do think that it also has empowered people and brought attention to issues. Iran, for example, has had this brutal crackdown on women over the last couple of years. And the ability of people in Iran to highlight these and bring videos and photos has created a measure of accountability and helped us cover a story that, frankly, we in the media haven't done a great job with. So I'm profoundly ambivalent about social media.
It's a double-edged sword, I agree, because it has empowered people all over the world to report things that are happening in their communities and their countries in a way that they didn't have that power before.
That's right. Unfortunately, it also empowered Putin to mess with our election. So how we sort that out is complicated.
Let me ask you a question from our audience. You've written compelling material about mortality, the biggest differences in health outcomes between rich and poor countries. Why were you interested in this, and why doesn't that issue get more attention?
You can't travel the world and see children who are starving and dying and recognize that more than 1/5 of children in the world today are physically stunted from malnutrition and cognitively stunted as well, even though that's a little harder to measure, and not just feel outrage at this loss of human potential, this loss of opportunity. And so you push back, you fight back with what you have, which is your keyboard. And so that's what I've tried to do on a lot of these global health issues. But I must say that it's not just a global health issue. And Mississippi today has a shorter life expectancy than Bangladesh. That is outrageous.
Yeah.
That is completely outrageous. And we know how to save a lot of those lives. We have the toolboxes. We certainly have the resources, and yet we don't. And that again, I see that in my own community, and so many folks dying unnecessarily, suffering greatly, and also inflicting great suffering. And I think we have some real failures. And I've got to say that a lot of these problems traditionally have been in the South. And it's no accident that it's Mississippi that has a shorter life expectancy than Bangladesh. I think there's often been a gratuitous cruelty in the South toward people who are suffering. Out west, on the West Coast, I think we have the best of intentions and often great values, but I think we also have to be really honest about this gulf between our good intentions and our outcomes. And the truth is that there's an awful lot of suffering in the West Coast, and we have repeatedly screwed up. And in COVID, the school closures, which were particularly present in the West Coast, really hurt a lot of low-income children. And the upshot is more children who are dropping out of school, missing their education, and they will die, in many cases, prematurely as a consequence. And I think we need to focus on how to improve outcomes in West Africa and in Mississippi, but I also think we need, since I'm here on the West Coast, I think we also need to look in our own backyard and do what we can to address some of these problems right here.
Another question from the audience. You talked about your own curiosity as a journalist, which is a fundamental requirement to being a good journalist. We have to be curious and be interested in a wide variety of things. This person asks, how do we replicate that kind of curiosity in our own lives? And it would occur to me to read as much of the New York Times and other papers as possible. Watch whatever is interesting to you, to expose yourself to as much information and material that you possibly can. But in terms of print journalism, that has become a little bit harder because print journalism has been so impacted by the changes we've seen in the media universe. Talk a little bit about, the New York Times is still thriving, I believe. Washington Post is still there, but so many other papers have folded.
Yeah, we have a real crisis in the business model of journalism. And in small towns across the country, newspapers have just collapsed. Often these are places where it's one-party county or one-party town. And so there is no opposition that is able to provide accountability, scrutiny, oversight. And without that news organization, there's nobody to improve governance, and I think that's a real loss. I would never have said this 10 or 20 years ago, but I now am in favor of government grants to support local news organizations in communities on the model of the National Endowment for the Arts. And, so the NEA will support like a theater troupe or a dance troupe or something in a small town. And I think that's great. But I think it's probably even more important than that town have a local news organization than that it have a theater troupe. And so I've come around on that group, on that issue. And while the New York Times, Washington Post still have a business model, AI is a real challenge. We don't know if we will have a business model 5 or 10 years from now, and AI is kind of hanging over us like a sword of Damocles. As somebody who deeply believes in the benefits of journalism, I think we've got to sort out that business model.
Yeah, it scares me sometimes to think about what the future of journalism might be, or what we would be like without a really healthy, group of journalists in this country. What is the biggest challenge facing journalism and journalists today? Is it AI? Is it apathy? Is it too much competition? Too little competition? What is it from your perspective?
So, I would say that by far the biggest challenge is simply this question of the business model, especially for local journalism. I think that's enormous. Secondly, I think it's the distrust that is directed to us. The distrust is a feature of really all institutions, but it's certainly directed at us in journalism, and it makes it harder for us to play our traditional role as referees and guardrails in a democracy, which I think is not only a challenge to the journalists, but also to the structure of democracy itself. And as somebody who has seen has lost a lot of friends along the way in journalism covering wars and conflicts. When I see people with these T-shirts that say, what is it, tree, rope, journalist, some assembly required, it's really painful to see that really poisonous distrust of journalists, recognizing that there is so much bad journalism out there, but there's also some extraordinarily good journalism that is trying to do the right thing.
And it's so fundamentally important to who we are and what we're about. I remember covering Donald Trump's inauguration in Washington, and as everyone was leaving, we go down close as everyone is, and we call it fishing because we're looking for local people from the Bay Area, so we hope that by me being out there, someone will go, hey, I know you from Channel 7, well, come over here and talk to me. So some guy walked by, older gentleman, we're just standing there shooting, and just walked by and went, fake news, and it's painful to us because they're damning all of us in one, and there's a lot of bad journalism, but there's far more good journalism than bad journalism, I believe.
I think that's true. I mean, I do think that we in journalism have to do a better job. I think we can do a better job in outreach. I think we can do a better job covering working class America. I think we can show more respect to people of faith. I mean, I think we do periodically screw up. And there's debate in journalism about to what extent we should platform conservative opinions. And there are some young progressives who think that we shouldn't platform views that are damaging to the country. And I completely disagree with that. I mean, I think that my liberal opinions will have more credibility if they are escorted by conservative opinions. And I also have enough confidence that my liberal opinions can actually win a fair fight with conservative opinions. And so I believe it's actually useful to and I think we'd win more trust among conservatives around the country. I wonder if you buy this or not. So I think that one of the challenges, I deeply believe that one of the fundamental things you learn as a journalist is humility, partly because we're always making mistakes. And so the fact that you're always making mistakes teaches you that humility, but also, whether as journalists or just as citizens, as members of the public, it's important to take moral positions, to take a moral stance, to stand up for what you believe in. But there's a contradiction there in taking a moral position while acknowledging that maybe you're wrong. And I think it's actually quite useful to live with that contradiction. I try to do that. And basically my solution to that contradiction is that I believe one should unflinchingly take a moral stance and stand up for what one's best understanding of the right is. And at the same time acknowledge that we make mistakes, that we may be wrong, that a year or 10 years from now we may think, how could we ever have thought that? And when you manage that contradiction, then it somewhat reduces the self-righteousness, the sanctimony, the finger-wagging quality that tends to accompany advocacy, and none of those things sanctimony has never helped convince anybody of anything. I think that actually improves one's advocacy rather than undermines it.
But I think it's also important to realize it's okay to be wrong sometimes too. It's so fine to be wrong. Just acknowledge it when you are.
Thank goodness.
Right?
I have a long record of...
Well, I always say, journalists, none of us got ordained. We just got hired, so we do make mistakes. But the point is to try to be the best you can be at that moment and correct the mistakes when you make them.
One of the really useful lessons I learned right when I first moved to China as a foreign correspondent, I studied Chinese. Here I was going to be covering more than 1 billion people, and we moved into the official New York Times residence, which we knew was bugged. And somebody had pointed out where they said some of the bugs were this little cubby hole covered with a screen. So I had that journalistic curiosity, so I pried off that screen with a claw hammer, and I peered in with a flashlight, and there was all this electronic gadgetry.
No kidding.
There. and I saw the Chinese characters on top, and I was so proud of myself. I could read and recognize those Chinese characters, and they said electronic sound carrying device. I had nailed this. I'm like, my first week in Beijing, and I found the bugs, and my wife and I were so well prepared for this because we had read spy novels. So we talked and we decided, okay, this is going to be our secret disinformation channel to state security. We figured this out. We're masters of the universe. We're so full of ourselves. And then just then a friend arrives at the front door, and we find out what an electronic sound carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. That was a really useful lesson to absorb right when we began to cover this place. That, the world is complicated, and whenever you're too confident that you're right, that's the moment to beware.
Yeah, that's a good point. Talk a little bit about China, not only your experience there, but where you believe the United States and China are heading. Are you gravely concerned? Do you think it'll be okay? What do you see in the future for our relationship with China?
So, my vision of China, my view of China will always be shaped by that terrible night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, when I was on Tiananmen Square in this crowd of student democracy protesters, and the government opened fire on us and started massacring the people around me. You never forget seeing a modern army turn its weapons of war on unarmed protesters. That just seared me. And I also, the real heroes that night were these uneducated rickshaw drivers who, whenever there was a lull in the firing, they would drive out toward the troops and pick up the bodies of kids who'd been killed and injured and drive them to the hospitals. And in this country, I think there's so many folks who don't appreciate democracy and are willing to undermine it. And to see people who didn't have it, and yet were much more clear-eyed about the benefits of democracy, to the point that they were willing to risk their lives for it, left a very, very deep impression upon me. And so I see China, inevitably, to some degree, through that prism of the repression that I saw, of friends who've been imprisoned, and yet, I've also seen this extraordinary explosion of wealth and income there that have lifted more people out of poverty more quickly than any country in human history, where a child in Beijing today has a longer life expectancy than a child in Washington, D.C. And that, too, is real. I think Xi Jinping has been a disaster for China. I think there is a real risk of a conflict in the South China Sea or around Taiwan. And I think we need to be prepared for that. And I think the Biden administration actually has done a very good job working with the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan to try to make Xi Jinping understand the risks if he were to make a move on Taiwan. But I also think that sometimes in this country we are so fearful of the risk of that conflict that we take steps that actually increase the likelihood of it. There's a fine line between deterrence and provocation. And sometimes we don't always get that right, or we engage in steps that are symbolic without actually reducing the risks. And I do think that Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an example of something that was purely symbolic and didn't actually make Taiwanese safer, and in fact probably made them somewhat less safe. And that's what the polling in Taiwan suggests what people there thought.
But that was not the impression people or the assumption people had here.
Right. And I think that in the U.S., one thing the Democrats and Republicans all agree on is that China is, that we have to stand firmly against China. And I think there's a lot to that. But I just think we need to make sure that the steps we take are ones that are substantive and not performative, and that they actually improve security, and that we recognize that we have to have interests with the Chinese people, and we don't confuse the Chinese people, the Chinese government. I think periodically we have taken steps that have made it harder for ordinary Chinese to come here to study in ways that would actually enrich our country and have exchanges, this kind of thing. So I think there are very fine lines, and inevitably I'm not quite sure we draw those quite right.
What about other emerging issues or threats from other nations? What do you see 5, 10 years down the road beyond China that we should be paying attention to now? Is there anything that comes to mind?
So I think that Russia and Ukraine are an enormously important issue in the sense that if we let Russia succeed in Ukraine, then I think that does place at risk Moldova, for example, and the Baltics. But I think it also increases the risk to Taiwan. I think that Xi Jinping is weighing what would happen if he were to make a move on Taiwan. And I think one bit of important feedback is the cost to Russia of going into Ukraine. And so, particularly in the GOP, the degree to which people have been very adamant about the importance of supporting Taiwan, and yet at the same time reluctant to support Ukraine, makes no sense whatsoever. One of the best ways to support Taiwan and to reduce the risk of conflict there is to be supporting Ukraine. More broadly, Sudan is a horrific humanitarian crisis right now that isn't getting nearly enough attention. And one of the costs of the war in Gaza has been that these other humanitarian crises around the world have been overshadowed and aren't getting the resources or the time from officials that they normally would. Tigray in Ethiopia is again a case of where it may well be that hundreds of thousands of people have died in Tigray and gotten almost no attention in the West, and that's a failing in journalism. It's a failure in the broader public that we let this happen on our watch.
China was one. Where your most memorable assignments been? What parts of the world have you enjoyed being in the most as a journalist? Not as a tourist, as a journalist. The kind of reporting you were able to do in those places that was the most interesting.
I mean, I've got to say, China, just the sense of being in this vast civilization, this vast country, trying to understand what is going on, watching it as it's going through this extraordinary transformation. In some ways, the most important place in the world in the last 50 years arguably was China as it went through this metamorphosis from this poor rural country to one of the great powers in the world today, and watching that unfold and the pressures for and against democracy, the brutality inflicted on Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, the one-child policy and the brutality that was entailed there, and yet this incredible flowering of education that was going on. I just found it such a rich and morally complicated story to cover. Coupled with the fact that every time I left our apartment, I was tailed, and constant risk of getting friends in trouble in ways that were infuriating. But
was it intimidating or just annoying? Or both?
It wasn't exactly. I knew they weren't going to do anything terrible to me, but they were trying to find my Chinese sources, who were basically friends, and throw them in a prison. And
that is terrifying in a way, because you're worried about their safety.
These were people who trusted me, and journalists haven't been careful enough with their sources. And one of my colleagues got her two Chinese friends, into prison for, I forget, 10 years and 7 years or something. And that just, I remember that night that happened. It just, my wife and I couldn't sleep because we thought, however careful we are, there's a risk that is going to happen to us and to our friends.
It would be devastating. I can't even imagine. You write a lot about your wife, Cheryl. She's been a real partner, a real asset for you, and a difficult career that often ends marriages, but it seemed to have strengthened yours.
Yeah. Cheryl has been... so for much of our careers, she was also a New York Times journalist, and that was so helpful. When we were in China, the foreign ministry would periodically summon me to the foreign ministry to yell at me for stories that Cheryl had written, and I was like,
"Hey,
you think she listens to me?" and I got her at one point this Chinese painting of these two little songbirds on this winter branch with snow around them, kind of huddled together. And it kind of felt that way. That's the way we were, but we very I mean, it really helped to have us there, and so we, and one of the things that I think the most difficult moral question I've ever faced as a journalist occurred when we were in China, and there was a young man who had helped us cover Tiananmen, and he was imprisoned. He escaped from prison. He came to Beijing and asked for help fleeing the country. The one pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help escape felons flee the country. But he's a 19-year-old kid. If we hadn't helped him, he would be caught at some point, and terrible things would have happened to him. And so I was wrestling with my obligations to the New York Times. If I was caught, bad things would happen to me. The New York Times bureau might be closed down, but also my obligations to this young man. And Cheryl had a truer moral compass than I did on that. And she said, no, we've got to help him. He's in trouble because of us. And I was also worried that I'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison. And I wondered if this might be, some setup. And she, again, said, we've got to help him. It's the right thing. And we did. And so he escaped. We were able to, he's now in the U.S. And, it's profoundly, it was maybe the most unprofessional thing I ever did as a journalist, but it's also one that I'm proudest of.
Yeah. You're still in touch with him?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you changed his life, saved his life.
He, when one of the things I was proud of when I ran for governor in my 10-minute political career, he donated $5,000 to the campaign.
Oh, wow.
And we reached out to him and said, he could not afford this. This was not, and we said, no need to do this. This is a little bit extravagant, and is the only campaign donor I ever said that to. And he said, Nick saved my life. I really want to do this. And I was really, really moved by that.
Since you brought it up, would you run for office ever again?
Cheryl might kill me if I did. It was an amazing adventure. I'm glad I did it. I was so frustrated by what was happening around Oregon, the problems we were having from home. In many ways, I think parallel to those problems with homelessness, with everybody's catalytic converter being stolen, with law and order, with education, with addiction, et cetera, and with the urban-rural divide. So I learned a lot from it, but I think I got it out of my system.
Was it interesting to be on the other side of a journalist's questions as a candidate this time?
Did
you learn?
It was so funny because my team thought, and I thought, okay, well, Christoph may not know anything about campaign finance. He may not know the local legislators, county commissioners, but the one thing he's going to be really good at is press conferences and doing interviews. And it turns out the thing that I was most incompetent at was doing interviews. And the basic problem was that I would answer questions. And I'd be asked some kind of difficult, awkward question. And after having had my questions evaded for decades, I was determined to answer these questions. And my team was like horrified. You answered that question.
Nobody does that.
And so they prepped me in journalistic evasion techniques and how to answer the question you want to be asked, not the one you're actually asked.
We're running out of time. I do want to ask this question. You've covered so many amazing things in your life and career. Is there a story you missed? Is there a story that you always wished you'd been a part of?
I wish there are many. I wished had covered the Balkans, Bosnia, Kosovo, et cetera. I think that was a really important story. I've written a lot about gender equity in terms of inequality directed at women abroad and at home. Everything from sexual violence to girls' education, health, and so on. One of the stories that I think I was somewhat late to is gender inequity in the other direction. And we have a real problem with boys and men in this country. And boys in particular are much more likely to fail at school and to drop out of school, to kill themselves, to wrestle with addictions. And you can't have a healthy country if you've got so many folks left behind and struggling. And how we resolve those problems, I'm not entirely sure, but it's striking that in colleges, for example, in America, the gender divide now is greater than it was when Title IX was introduced, but the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's not being talked about, really. It's not being talked about, really.
Not being talked about, and I don't think because when women were hugely underrepresented in education, we figured out some architecture to help rectify that divide. And we sort of understand intuitively the brutality and inequality and unfairness of the traditional kinds of inequity. I don't think we've fully yet understood the crisis for a lot of boys and men in this country, and it starts young. And I see this in my community with a lot of boys in chaotic, dysfunctional homes, and they're just on a path to drop out of school, end up in prison, and both suffer greatly and inflict great suffering on others. And I think we have to do a better job trying to address that crisis. And when I was writing about women's rights, people always were a little surprised that a man was writing about women's rights. And I always said that, just as the Holocaust wasn't just a Jewish issue, and gay rights weren't just an issue for the LGBT community, and when women suffer enormous discrimination, that's not just a problem for women. It's a human rights problem for all. And likewise, when there's so many boys who are struggling around the country and dropping out of school, that's not a problem just for boys and men. It's a problem for all of us, for all of society. And I think we need to come to terms with that.
Well said, Nick. We have time for one last question, and I saved this because I want to give you the opportunity to comment on this. There's an aspiring journalism student out there, aspiring journalism student. What advice would you give this person to have a career in journalism that is meaningful in a changing journalism universe?
So, first of all, welcome to journalism. I mean, it is an amazing privilege to be engaged in these issues. I think it's incredibly satisfying. I'm sure your parents are probably horrified at the idea of going into a profession where you may not actually draw a paycheck, and one doesn't know how that will come. But I'd also say that the tools that you learn in journalism are also broadly applicable elsewhere, so they're transferable, I think. And some of the advice is obviously, read a lot, practice writing. That's how one gets better. But I would also come back to this question of the importance of humility. I think that because we are given a microphone, it becomes really easy for us to really relish the sound of our own voices and to think that sometimes we learn that, that if we simply declare something with a tone of utter authority, then it comes across, as that's the truth. And actually, often there's a lot of ambiguity and we screw things up. So I think always proceeding with a deep sense of how complicated truth is, how many versions of reality there are, the risk that we will get things wrong. I think that's a really good escort to one's career. And then again, finally, this notion of moral purpose. Just acknowledging that it's difficult and that sometimes in trying to find that moral purpose, we screw people over and we end up creating a backlash or we end up adding to our problems. But that done right, journalism really does serve, I think, this higher purpose beyond just quarterly earnings of the news organization that we work for. And that power to shine a light on something in ways that make it more likely to be addressed is an incredible privilege that we have. And used wisely, it really can make a difference.
Can make a huge difference, obviously. And you have made a huge difference in your remarkable career, Nicholas, and we're honored to have you with us. Our thanks to Nicholas Kristof, author of Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, and he has lived a reporter's life.
Thank you.
Let me encourage you to pick up a copy of Nicholas's new book here, and he'd be happy to sign it for you at your local bookstore if you're listening to us. And if you'd like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming like this possible, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Dan Ashley. Thank you for your attention today. We'll see you next time. Bravo.
Thank you, Dan.
Bravo.